The Hearing Trumpet by Leonora Carrington. Page 42. What particular type of medicine is the doctor's specialty? I asked, in order not to show my surprise, which would not have been polite. Gambit is a kind of sanctified psychologist, said Georgina. The result is holy reason, like Freudian table turning, quite frightful and as phony as hell. If one could only get out of this dump, he would cease to be important, being the only male around, you know. It is really too crashingly awful, all these women. The place creeps with ovaries until one wants to scream. We might as well be living in a beehive. Our talk at that moment was interrupted by Mrs. Gambit, who appeared in the doorway carrying a bucket of potatoes. I sincerely hope she had not been listening to our conversation. There are at least 2 members of the community missing for the morning tasks, she said, her hand pressed to her brow, which looked agonized. It is possible that I might be doing everything alone while you all sit around and gossip. Everything is possible. Still, for your ultimate advantage, I must not allow the habit of laziness to kill your already slim chances of saving your souls. Or what might become souls, with perseverance and work. One could hardly give this dignified title to the fickle emotions most of you use, instead of an immortal self. With a pained smile, she turned towards the kitchen regions. Georgina stuck out her tongue at the receding back. Nevertheless, we got up and followed her, talking quietly about the weather. There will be movements at 5 o'clock this afternoon in the workshop, said Mrs. Gambit, over her shoulder. Anybody who is late will forfeit her supper in the usual way. What are the movements? I asked Georgina, but she merely made a hideous grimace. Mrs. Gambit heard my question and stopped, setting down the bucket of potatoes. You had better hear at once about the movements, she told me. Anyone who does not understand their significance can never get the full meaning of inner Christianity. The movements were given to us in the past by somebody in the tradition. They have many meanings I am not at liberty to disclose to you yet, as you have only just arrived, but I can say one of their outer meanings is the harmonious evolution of the whole organism to different special rhythms which I play to you on the harmonium. Do not expect to grasp the meaning of the movements when you first begin. Just start off as you would any ordinary task of the day. I did not dare ask her if these movements were gymnastics. I felt very worried, and only nodded my head several times. I had meant to nod once, looking at her with what I hoped was an intelligent expression. Somehow my head went on nodding, nervously, and I had a job to get it stopped. Georgina nudged me and said something, but I could not hear as I had forgotten my trumpet in the lighthouse. I had begun to like Georgina. She seemed so gay. She must have belonged to some fashionable group of people before her family found her too senile to keep at home. She must have had a very exciting and sophisticated life. I hoped she would tell me about it one day, which she did, several times over. In the kitchen, we all sat around a large scrubbed table, peeling vegetables. Those who were not present must have been occupied with other work outside. Including Mrs. Gambit, there were 5 of us. Georgina, Vera Van Tocht, Natasha Gonzalez, and myself. Mrs. Van Tocht whom I never could call by her first name, was very imposing. She was fat, so fat, that her face and shoulders were almost the same width. In the midst of all this face were little puckered features, cunning eyes, and pursed mouth. Natasha Gonzalez was also on the heavy side, but looked quite small compared to Mrs. Van Tocht. Natasha wore her hair in a bun. Having Indian blood, she had more hair than anybody else, and we envied her. Her face was a pale lemon color, denoting a bad liver. Her eyes were large, like prunes, with heavy lids. Everybody talked and worked at the same time, but as I could not hear them, I dedicated myself to cleaning French beans. French beans in this country are rather coarse and have strings on each side like ropes. We had been working for about an hour when there was a strange incident. Natasha Gonzalez poured all her vegetables and dirty water into my lap and got up with her arms raised and her eyes popping. She stood rigid for at least 2 minutes and collapsed into her chair. Her eyes were now closed and her head sunk on her breast. "She hears voices," yelled Georgina in my ear. "When she does that, she thinks she's getting a stigmata and starts fattening up for Easter." In spite of her fainting condition, I saw Natasha's mouth tighten, as if she heard. Mrs. Van Tocht looked at Georgina angrily and got up to administer wet dishcloths to Natasha's head. Mrs. Gambit said something I could not hear, but looked uninterested. After a while, the vegetable peeling was resumed. When the clock struck 12, we went out for a walk around the garden before lunch. I had to change my dress as I was soaking wet, having received a large pan full of water on my lap. I hoped not to catch cold. Anna Wirtz was stretched comfortably in her deck chair and seemed to be talking to herself. That afternoon, I arrived in the workshop punctually at 5 o'clock for the movements. There were chairs around the walls, but the room was otherwise bare, except for the harmonium. We all sat down in silence while Mrs. Gambit appeared and stood beside the harmonium. I had thoughtfully brought my trumpet so as not to miss anything. I felt very anxious. "This afternoon, we are going to begin with primary 0, said Mrs. Gambit, passing a hand across her brow. "We have a newcomer amongst us who has no experience yet of the work. For her benefit, I will give a demonstration of primary 0. She paused, looked at the floor for a moment, as if collecting herself, then started to rub her stomach in a circular clockwise motion, and tapped the top of her head with the other hand. I felt relieved, as I had done this in the nursery and did not have much difficulty repeating Mrs. Gambit's movements. After a moment's demonstration, she sat down at the harmonium and applied herself to the instrument with great energy for someone of such a delicate constitution. Not only did her arms, elbows, and shoulders heave, but she actually bounced up and down on her seat, as if riding a mechanical horse. We all did the movements, changing hands every 10 rounds on the stomach. It was not too strenuous, but I was pleased when we stopped. Mrs. Gambit twirled around on her seat and addressed me before I got the trumpet to my ear. "Eh? Eh? Eh?" I said, as she repeated, "Marian Leatherby, the first movements are not widdershins, please. Watch Maud Wilkins carefully. She is familiar with most of the exercises." We repeated the same thing 4 times, and each time the harmonium got louder. "Now, everybody get up and we will run through the numbers 4 and 5. Biz, Marian Leatherby, Kindly stand by and watch the others. You will participate next time." I walked over and stood by her obediently, and they started what was for me impossible to follow. The only thing which was clear was that they stood on one leg like storks and wobbled dangerously. The rest was a series of jerks where arms flew out in all directions, and heads twisted and turned, till I thought their necks must break. Then a terrible thing happened to me. I started to laugh and could not stop. Tears poured down my face, and I covered my mouth with my hand, hoping they would think I had a secret sorrow and was weeping and not laughing. Mrs. Gambit stopped her exercise on the harmonium. "Mrs. Leatherby, if you are unable to control your emotions, kindly leave the room." I left and sat down on the nearest bench, where I laughed and laughed and laughed. Of course, this was irreverent behavior, but there was nothing I could do about it. Even when I was still a young woman, I was occasionally overtaken by spasms of uncontrollable laughter, always in public. Once, I remember in a theater accompanied by my friend Marlborough, I had to be almost carried out because a man in a frock coat got up to recite some very dramatic poetry. Whether this was a nervous reflex or the poetry seemed to me really comic, I cannot remember. Marlborough always seemed to be present when I was overtaken by my spasms, which he was pleased to call Marian's maniac laughter. He always enjoyed seeing me making an exhibition of myself. This got me wondering how Marlborough was enjoying Venice. He must be constantly floating about in a gondola, possibly accompanied by his crippled sister. Again, I asked myself, what could possibly be wrong with this sister that I had never even seen a snapshot of during 30 years' friendship with Marlborough? It must be something quite spectacular, like having two heads. In this case, he would hardly take her out in gondolas unless, perhaps, she sat behind a gauze curtain, thick gauze, or even cheesecloth. Marlborough comes from a rather aristocratic family, so one could expect some kind of peculiarity. Although I had a mad grandmother, and my family was not aristocratic at all. But can cows be aristocrats? Two-headed calves are quite common in fairs. I was thinking all this when I was joined by Mrs. Van Tocht, who sat down ponderously. She was still breathing heavily from the exertion of the movements. Somebody is singing "O Sole Mio" to Marlborough, who is floating around in a gondola with his two-headed sister, I said, and stopped abruptly. Really, I must learn not to say my thoughts aloud. The image had been so clear that I had seen her two heads through the lemon cheesecloth curtains of the gondola. Mrs. Van Tocht ignored what I said and leaned on me in a conspiratorial fashion, so that I had difficulty in adjusting my hearing trumpet. "You may confide your life's tragedy to me," she said, puffing and panting. "We all have our trials and sorrows on the path of life, till we see the light." "I have had my difficulties," I replied, with the intention of complaining about Muriel and Robert. This would have been highly agreeable. But just as I was beginning about the television set, she interrupted me with an impatient gesture. "Yes, I understand all. There are a few dark corners in the human heart that I have not probed with my special insight. I am not a visionary like Mrs. Gonzalez, Natasha, dear Natasha. But I have astral insight which enables me to help and comfort my fellow creatures. In my own humble way, I have turned many erring souls to the light. Yet My poor gifts are nothing compared to the wonderful powers of Natasha. She is controlled, you understand. Spiritual control is a rare and beautiful gift. Natasha is the pure vessel through which unseen powers are made manifest to us. But not I, but that which works within me. Those are Natasha's constant words. She has a great limpid humility, like the Master, whose miracles were worked with the words, not I, but my Father, which is in heaven. During this pause, I hastened to get back to Robert and the television set. My grandson, Robert, I said, has an unpleasant addiction to television. Before he installed this horrible apparatus in the house, I used to sit in the lounge after dinner and keep the whole family amused with fairy tales and anecdotes of my past life. I pride myself that I can tell a very amusing story when I wish. Nothing vulgar, of course, but witty and even spicy when I am not too troubled with my rheumatism. Rheumatism, of course, is a great hindrance to funny stories. Now, my daughter-in-law, Muriel, is very unsympathetic to rheumatism. She's also very greedy with chocolates, which she always hides, a very unpleasant habit. I often wonder how Galahad could ever manage to marry a person like Muriel. I was beginning to enjoy myself, but Mrs. Van Tolt soon stopped me, talking with an imperious gesture. You should never pride yourself on anything. Even something as trivial as a comic anecdote is a spiritual plague, if used as a source of self-love. Humility is the fountain of light. Pride is a disease of the soul. Many people come to me seeking advice and spiritual comfort when I lay my hands on them to calm their anxiety and fill them with love and light. I always say, first, be humble. A full cup cannot receive. She was almost sitting on top of me. I could hardly breathe. Yet I was determined to tell her more about Muriel. My daughter-in-law started giving bridge parties after Robert brought the television set to the house. At least it would have been bridge in my day. Now they call it canasta party. They actually turned me out of the lounge when people came in to play this ridiculous game. The first evening I refused to leave the room and told 14 parrot stories without forgetting the end of more than 6. I hoped that she would ask me to tell one of those stories, and I had just decided to tell her the Yorkshire parrot story when she began again. Wednesday evenings, Natasha gives little groups in our bungalow. I am sure you would find great spiritual profit if you joined us. There would only be Natasha, Maud, you, and myself. Oh, very cozy and intimate. Natasha gives us the messages sent to each one of us individually from the great unseen, and then we hold hands around a little table and exchange our vibrations. There are times when we are favored with materializations from the astral plane. I had only got halfway through the parrot story when she heaved herself off the bench and said, Then we shall expect you at 8:30 on Wednesday evening at my bungalow. Do not mention this to Mrs. Gambit, as she has great spiritual pride and is jealous of Natasha's wonderful powers. Besides, we keep the circle a secret in order to concentrate astral energy. With these mysterious words, she lumbered off, leaving me wondering how the Yorkshire parrot story ended. Anna Wirtz suddenly appeared on the path, and I got up and turned towards my bungalow, pretending I had not seen her. But she walked faster than I and soon caught up with me. Anna did not really prevent me from enjoying the evening air, and without my hearing trumpet, her voice was a distant murmur, like a crowd on a far-off football field. Making no attempt to listen, I saw with delight that Venus was out and sparkled over the treetops. I longed to tell Anna how I loved this bright planet, but I knew that would be out of the question. She was looking rather cross. Probably she had been working dreadfully hard again, although I could not imagine what she did that was so exhausting. How delightful it would be to find a few people, or even one person, unconditionally thrilled by what I had to say. I imagined telling an excited audience parrot stories for hours on end, without anyone interrupting or yawning. Or again to explain how very unfair Muriel and Robert had always been to me, and how Galahad used to have a strong character, which was gradually sapped away by Muriel's nagging. Mere daydreams, one might say, yet there are people who talk a lot and nobody ever dares interrupt them. What can they possibly have to say that is so interesting? Perhaps if one had ghostly visitations like Mrs. Gonzalez, it would be possible to excite interest in other people, especially if one talked to them about themselves. There, I suppose, was the secret. People only like whatever concerns themselves, and I am no exception to this rule. We all like to be popular, but what a price to pay. Always to talk about the other person and never about oneself. It is doubtful if one would get any enjoyment at all, unless, of course, one was constantly invited to tea with French pastries. Port wine might be served instead of tea, if a very interesting person happened to prefer that. Especially if I was that interesting person, and I only talked about other people. In that case, perhaps, they might consider changing beverages. I saw myself sitting in a warm parlor with scarlet curtains, surrounded by happy, confidential, but vague faces. I drank glass after glass of rich Portuguese wine, occasionally washed down with a tiny French eclair. Everybody got happier and happier. They burst into applause as I reached the lighthouse. Anna Wirtz had disappeared. She must have noticed that I had not been paying attention to what she was saying. Poor Anna, how terrible for her that nobody ever liked listening to her talk. Venus sparkled over the trees, and it was almost supper time. I fancied a nice boiled egg for supper, but one had to eat whatever appeared on the table. Although Dr. Gambit allowed me to abstain from meat, I could not take 2 helpings of vegetables instead, so I sometimes got up hungry from the table. He told us that as one grows older, one needs less food, that overeating killed old people quicker than anything else. I dare say he was right, but we old people get a lot of simple pleasure from eating. I wondered how Dr. Gambit and Mrs. Van Tocht kept so fat on our frugal meals. I supposed they did some private eating in their rooms, though how Mrs. Van Tocht managed to get extra food was a mystery. Mrs. Gambit was always watching over the kitchen like a lynx, and the storeroom was kept locked. I decided to discuss all this with Georgina, who seemed generally well informed. There was another important question I decided to discuss with Georgina. That concerned the portrait of the nun, which hung opposite my place at mealtimes. During meals, Dr. Gambit would usually make long discourses on theoretical matters which I did not understand. While the doctor held forth, I had plenty of time to examine the winking nun. My interest increased as time went on. Georgina was cultured and often mentioned famous artists that had been madly in love with her. So, pretending my interest was purely artistic, I questioned her about the painting. It might be the Zoberan school, she said, looking uncommonly thoughtful. Probably painted in the late 18th century Spanish, of course. An Italian could never have done anything so enchantingly sinister. A nun with a leer. Unknown master. Do you suppose she's really winking, or is she blind in one eye? I asked, anxious for Georgina's opinion on a more personal aspect of the lady. She is definitely winking. The body old bag is probably peeking at the monastery through a hole in the wall, watching the monks prancing around in their knickers. Georgina had a one-track mind. It is beautiful, she added. I wonder the Gams let it hang among their hideous possessions. Everything in the house ought to have been burnt long ago, apart from the leering abbess. Certainly the painting had a force all its own, and I was pleased that Georgina was also impressed. She was such a cultured person, almost an aristocrat. Really, it was strange how often the leering abbess occupied my thoughts. I even gave her a name, keeping it strictly to myself. I called her Doña Rosalinda Álvarez de la Cueva. A nice, long name, Spanish style. She was abbess, I imagined, of a huge Baroque convent on a lonely and barren mountain in Castile. The convent was called El Convento de Santa Bárbara de Tartarus. The bearded patroness of Limbo said to play with unbaptized children in this nether region. How all these fancies occurred to me I do not know, but they kept me amused, especially during sleepless nights. Old people do not sleep much. Yes, said Georgina, how those Spaniards understood the painting of black drapery. So much more superbly blackly depressing than anyone else's black. The old lady's habit has the texture of orchid petals and the color of limbo. It really is a wonderful painting. Her face, surrounded by that white starched frill, is as luminous as the full moon, and just as bewitching. Somehow I felt that Georgina understood the painting of the leering abbess better than I ever could. 3 days after my arrival at Lighthouse Hall, I had my first private interview with Dr. Gambit. I was summoned to his study by a small piece of pink memorandum paper bearing this message: Marian Leatherby, kindly report to my office at 6 p.m. L. Gambit, Psych.